The late autumn air bit through Marcus Elijah Turner's jacket as he stepped out of the silver rental car. The fading sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets of Ashland Springs, a small town tucked deep within the heart of Missouri. He hadn't planned to stop here. It was supposed to be a quick detour, just long enough to visit an old army buddy recovering from surgery. But the detour was about to turn into something far darker. Marcus had spent most of the past decade serving overseas. A highly decorated colonel in the U.S. Army. He had led missions through war zones, stood before generals, and carried the weight of lives on his back. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sheer weight of suspicion he felt as he walked into the town square. A black man alone in military casuals. Walking past aging brick buildings lined with flags and whispers. He noticed the stares almost immediately. Two white teenagers by a coffee shop stopped their conversation and watched him with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. An older man pumping gas across the street froze when Marcus glanced his way. The discomfort was thick enough to taste. He brushed it off as nerves. Maybe they just weren't used to seeing newcomers. He had parked near the public library and was checking his phone for directions to the hospital when the sound of screeching tires caught his ear. Moments later, two patrol cars boxed in his rental. Officers stepped out briskly, hands already hovering near their weapons. Marcus raised his brow. "Sir, we need you to step away from the vehicle," one of the officers demanded. Marcus turned slowly, palms visible. "Is something wrong, officer? Step away. Hands where we can see them. I'm Colonel Marcus Turner, United States Army. I'm just visiting a friend at the..." Now, the tone left no room for discussion. Marcus did as he was told, placing his hands behind his head as instructed. Within seconds, they had him against the hood of the car. Cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a stolen vehicle," the officer explained, though his voice carried more judgment than justification. "I rented this car. The paperwork is in the glove compartment. This is a mistake." But they didn't check. They didn't listen. One officer rifled through his pockets while the other read him his rights. The bystanders watched silently, some taking photos, others just turning away. As Marcus was forced into the backseat, he realized something cold and familiar. In Ashland Springs, his uniform didn't matter. His name didn't matter. All they saw was the color of his skin. At the station, Marcus sat handcuffed to a bench, flanked by tired linoleum walls and flickering overhead lights. Time blurred into a monotony of waiting and unanswered questions. The officers avoided his gaze, murmuring quietly behind a closed glass door. When someone finally approached him, it was a stout man in a brown sheriff's jacket, chewing on a toothpick like it was a cigarette. "Sheriff Douglas Clay. Colonel Turner, is it?" Clay said with a smirk, not bothering to hide his disbelief. "Bit of a strange place for someone like you to be visiting, don't you think? I told your officers, I'm visiting a friend at Ashland Regional. He just had bypass surgery. I've done nothing wrong." Clay shrugged. "You matched the description of a suspect. SUV, black male, medium build, wearing military-style clothes. We had to be sure. That's profiling. It's called being thorough." The sheriff walked away, and Marcus was left alone again. No one offered him a phone call. No one checked his ID or scanned the rental information. Hours passed before a new officer, Officer Kelsey, entered and finally checked the glove compartment of the rental car. He returned looking slightly confused, holding Marcus's military ID and rental agreement. "Everything checks out," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Then why am I still here?" Marcus asked, voice edged with disbelief. Clay returned just as Marcus asked the question. "We'll be filing charges anyway. The arresting officers claim you resisted." "That's a lie. I complied with every word they said. Tell it to the judge." There was something in the sheriff's voice. Something smug. Marcus could see it clearly now. This wasn't about justice. This was about control, about making an example. And Marcus, for all his medals and service, was now just another name in a file. The courthouse of Ashland Springs stood like a relic from another era, white columns, a rusting flagpole, and a statue of blind justice cracked at the base. Inside, the air was stiff, heavy with old wood polish and older attitudes. Judge Ronald Blake had presided over this courthouse for nearly 2 decades. Tall and gaunt with thinning silver hair and a jaw that never unclenched. He had once been considered a rising star in conservative legal circles. But over time, his reputation had curdled. He'd become known for his impatience with disruptive defendants, his tendency to sentence harshly, and his unmistakable intolerance for those who didn't belong. The moment Marcus was brought before him for arraignment, Blake's eyes narrowed. "You're the soldier?" he asked, thumbing through the preliminary report. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied firmly. "I don't need titles in my courtroom. I meant no disrespect." Blake looked him over like a specimen. "According to the police report, you resisted arrest and became verbally combative. That true?" "That's false. I complied fully. The report is inaccurate." Blake's lips twitched. "So now you're calling officers liars?" "I'm saying what happened. I'm saying you're out of line." Marcus's attorney, a public defender named Donnelly who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, didn't intervene. When Marcus asked if he could speak in his own defense, Blake waved him off. "This court will enter a plea of not guilty on your behalf. Bail is denied. We'll see you next week." Marcus tried to speak again but was silenced by the bailiff's grip on his shoulder. Blake watched it all with a quiet satisfaction, then returned to the next file in the stack. The courtroom was nearly empty the day Marcus returned in chains. A single reporter from the local paper sat near the back, scribbling lazily. His lawyer arrived late, rumpled and apologetic, muttering about too many cases, too little time. As the trial began, the prosecution's case was flimsy at best. Grainy security footage of a man in a hoodie near the stolen vehicle, no face visible. The SUV had been abandoned 2 blocks from where Marcus had parked his rental. The stolen vehicle? A completely different make and model. Marcus's defense should have been straightforward. He had receipts. He had a paper trail. He had a military ID with timestamps that confirmed where he had been that entire day. But Judge Blake rejected key evidence on technicalities. He dismissed Marcus's request to call a character witness. He sustained every objection from the prosecution and overruled nearly all from the defense. When Marcus attempted to speak directly, Blake threatened him with contempt. "You're not in a war zone now, Colonel," he sneered. "You don't give the orders here." The courtroom was a stage, and Blake was its playwright, shaping a false narrative line by line. And no matter how much Marcus protested, his voice was drowned beneath the sound of the gavel pounding like a drumbeat of injustice. When the jury, composed entirely of white citizens from Ashland County, delivered their verdict, it was as though the outcome had been carved in stone long before the trial began. Guilty. Marcus stood tall, eyes fixed on Blake. He didn't flinch. He didn't plead. But inside, something began to burn, not rage. Not yet. It was the fire of memory. Of battles past. Of survival. And this was just the beginning. The silence that followed the word, guilty, felt like a vacuum. Marcus didn't move. He stood as he had in countless formations. Back straight, eyes forward, refusing to show any crack in the armor that had protected him through gunfire, explosions, and war zones. But this wasn't a battlefield, at least not in the traditional sense. It was colder, crueler. Here, justice wasn't blind, it had been taught to squint through prejudice. Judge Blake adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness. His expression was unreadable, but his voice rang clear through the courtroom as he read the sentence. 5 years. State penitentiary. No parole. The gavel came down like a shot. Marcus heard the gasp before he saw the woman rise from the back of the room. It was his wife, Eliza. She had managed to make it, standing now in stunned disbelief. Her hands trembled as they clutched the back of the wooden pew in front of her. She wasn't crying. Eliza never cried in public, but the devastation on her face cut deeper than any word spoken that day. 2 guards moved to flank Marcus. He turned toward Eliza, offering a faint nod, and in spoken promise, "This isn't over." As they led him out of the courtroom, Marcus glanced back one last time. Blake was already preparing for the next case. To him, it was just another docket number. Just another day. But for Marcus, it was the beginning of something else. He had spent his entire life fighting for the idea of America. Now, he would fight for the truth of it. The prison intake was a blur of noise, concrete, and iron. The clang of cell doors echoed through the halls like a grim drumbeat. Marcus, stripped of rank and rights, was now just inmate number 482,913. His new home was a 6 by 8 foot cell with a stained mattress and the stench of bleach. It wasn't the filth or the confinement that disturbed him the most, it was the indifference. Guards barely acknowledged his words. Inmates stared, some curious, some challenging, but Marcus carried himself with the silent weight of discipline and purpose. No one approached him for the first week. He kept to himself, eating quietly, rising early, exercising in the small yard when permitted. But he was always observing, studying the rhythm of the place. The dynamics between the inmates and the guards. The hidden language of survival. It wasn't long before word spread. "You were in the army?" a fellow inmate asked one afternoon in the yard. "I am," Marcus corrected. "Man, what's a guy like you doing in here?" "I was convicted of a crime I didn't commit." The man scoffed. "Aren't we all?" But Marcus didn't argue. He simply returned to his push-ups. Each repetition a silent act of resistance. He began documenting everything. When he wasn't reading or exercising, he wrote letters to lawyers, detailed notes about his arrest and trial, observations of abuses he saw inside the prison. He kept a journal, hiding it beneath a loose tile under his bed. 3 weeks in, he met Donovan Duke Reeves, an older inmate serving a life sentence who had once been a paralegal. Duke had a sharp mind, a bitter laugh, and a deep loathing for the justice system. "You don't belong here," Duke said after Marcus told him his story. "No one does," Marcus replied. "True, but you've got something most of us don't, people on the outside who still give a damn. Use that. Write, file, push. Don't let the walls win." That night, Marcus began drafting his first formal appeal. Back home, Eliza Turner sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork in front of her, legal forms, bills, letters, and Marcus's journals mailed before his trial. The kitchen used to be filled with laughter, the smell of roasted garlic, the click of her daughter Jasmine's heels rushing to class. Now it was a war room. Jasmine had returned home from her final semester at law school the moment the verdict came in. Her professors tried to convince her to finish her degree. But Jasmine had other plans. "How can I study the law?" she asked one of them, "when the law just put my father in prison for being black and standing still?" Eliza tried to be strong. But the burden was relentless. Calls with lawyers who offered little more than regret. Letters to journalists that went unanswered. Messages to veteran support groups that promised follow-up. Yet nothing moved. Jasmine was fire. While Eliza grieved, Jasmine fought. She researched case law, dug through court archives, and began compiling Judge Blake's sentencing history. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern. "Mom," she said one evening, spreading out files across the dining room table. "Look at this. Out of every person Blake has sentenced in the last 10 years, 82% have been black or Latino. That's double the town's minority population." Eliza looked up, eyes rimmed red. "You think we can prove that?" "I'm going to try, but we need help." Together, they reached out to the Equal Justice Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions. A young attorney named Carla Reyes called them back within 3 days. By the end of the week, Jasmine was officially part of a team working to free her father. Carla Reyes was a fighter. She had once been a public defender, then moved into advocacy when she grew tired of watching innocent people get crushed under the weight of systemic failure. She met Jasmine at a coffee shop near the courthouse, a stack of printouts already under her arm. "I've seen judges like Blake before," Carla said, setting down her coffee. "They hide behind the robe. They twist the system until it only protects people who look like them. But here's the thing. Patterns leave fingerprints." Together, Carla and Jasmine began the work. They pulled every public record from Judge Blake's tenure, transcripts, sentencing memos, complaint logs. They compiled it all into a spreadsheet that grew thicker by the day. One night, around 2 a.m., Jasmine stumbled on a series of internal judicial review documents hidden in a footnote of a disciplinary case. It mentioned Blake's courtroom being the subject of 2 prior ethics investigations, both dismissed quietly. "They buried this," Jasmine whispered. Carla's eyes lit up. "Then we dig it up." The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Blake had a history of excluding key witnesses, suppressing evidence, and issuing disproportionate sentences. But what they needed was a smoking gun, someone from inside the system who had seen it happen. That person came in the form of Harold Finch, a retired assistant district attorney who had prosecuted under Blake a decade earlier. Finch had retired early and moved to another county. Disillusioned, "I stayed silent for too long," Finch said when Carla and Jasmine found him. "But I remember Marcus. I remember the case. That judge didn't care about truth, just punishment. I've got files, and I'm ready to talk." With Finch on their side, the tide began to turn. Marcus wasn't just a name anymore. He was a symbol, and the fight for his freedom had only just begun. The house was small, tucked at the end of a gravel road in rural Boone County. The porch creaked with each step as Jasmine and Carla approached, bundled in scarves against the early winter wind. When Harold Finch opened the door, he looked older than his 62 years, tired eyes behind wire-framed glasses. Hands calloused from work that no longer involved courtrooms or closing arguments. Inside, the living room was modest. A fireplace crackled quietly, and the scent of old paper filled the air. Finch moved slowly but with purpose, walking over to an oak cabinet where a series of thick accordion folders were neatly filed. "I kept copies," he said simply, pulling several from the cabinet. "Not just from Marcus's case. From others. I knew one day I'd have to face this." The folder he handed Jasmine was labeled, "Blake, Discretionary Sentencing Patterns." Inside were copies of trial transcripts, memos, and internal emails between prosecutors and Blake's clerk. One message stood out. A prosecutor noting that, "Blake will swing harder if the defendant doesn't fit the town's image." Another mentioned that Blake had a gift for neutralizing certain types of witnesses. A euphemism Finch admitted was often code for Black or Latino defendants and experts. Finch sat with them for hours, recalling moments he had buried for years, cases where Blake had refused to hear mitigating circumstances, denied plea deals without cause, or steered juries with biased instructions. He described one case where a teenager caught shoplifting received the same sentence as an adult charged with assault, because the former was black. "I left the DA's office because of him," Finch said. "I couldn't live with the guilt. But I never thought I'd see anyone stand up to him and have a chance." Carla's hand trembled as she flipped through the last transcript. "With this and your testimony, we can file for a judicial complaint and motion for retrial. This could blow the whole thing open." Jasmine looked at Finch with fire in her eyes. "You're not just helping my father. You're helping everyone he buried." Finch nodded solemnly. "Then let's dig them up." The story broke quietly at first. A short article in a regional legal blog cited Finch's testimony and hinted at misconduct. Then, a syndicated criminal justice newsletter picked it up, adding details about Blake's judicial history and his ties to conservative donor groups. Within days, a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch contacted Carla for comment. By the end of the week, it was national. The Washington Post ran a front-page story, "From Colonel to Convict: The Story of Marcus Turner and the Judge Who Buried Him." Photos of Marcus in uniform, standing at Arlington Cemetery during a wreath-laying ceremony, were juxtaposed against grainy courthouse images of him in handcuffs. Cable news picked it up next. One segment on a major network aired Marcus's prison interview, his face calm, his voice measured, recounting the moment of his arrest. "They didn't see a colonel," he said. "They didn't see a husband or a father. They saw a threat." The internet exploded. Veterans groups released joint statements demanding a full investigation. Civil rights organizations launched petitions that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Social media hashtags flooded timelines. Hashtag Justice for Marcus. Hashtag Unmask the Robe. Hashtag Fix the Bench. Judge Blake, once untouchable, became the center of a firestorm. Still, in Ashland Springs, the local paper remained defensive. Their editorial claimed Blake was being unfairly vilified by outsiders who don't understand our values. The courthouse held fast. Blake himself refused interviews, releasing only a cold written statement through his clerk. "I stand by the integrity of my courtroom and the sanctity of the law." But Marcus's name was no longer just a case file. It was a rallying cry. The penitentiary allowed Marcus one 30-minute interview with the press. Cameras were not permitted, but audio was. A single journalist from NPR, Asha DuPont, sat across from him in a bare room with concrete walls and a steel table. "Colonel Turner," she began, recorder between them, "the world is listening. What do you want them to hear?" Marcus leaned forward, calm as ever. His hands, calloused and strong, were folded neatly on the table. This isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. I spent my life defending a country that promised liberty and justice for all. That promise was broken, not just for me, but for so many others. Ash's voice was soft. Do you believe justice is still possible? I believe it has to be. Otherwise, what are we fighting for? He spoke of his time in service, missions abroad, the weight of command, the lives saved and lost. He recalled being welcomed in countries thousands of miles away and profiled in the country he called home. He spoke not in anger, but with purpose, with clarity. This fight is not new, he said, but maybe, this time, enough people will stay awake long enough to finish it. The interview aired on NPR's Weekend Special. Listeners around the country called in to share their outrage, their support, and their own stories. A senator from Georgia quoted Marcus's words in a speech on the Senate floor. Military leaders wrote open letters demanding congressional review. Back in prison, Marcus sat on the edge of his cot that night and closed his eyes. Not in despair, but in focus. The battle was shifting, and this time, the battlefield was truth. Pressure mounted like a rising tide. By January, 3 congressional representatives had sent letters to the Department of Justice requesting a federal inquiry into Marcus's case and the broader conduct of Judge Blake. A task force was formed, composed of civil rights attorneys, retired judges, and federal oversight officials. In Ashland Springs, however, tensions boiled over. A rally held outside the courthouse drew hundreds of protesters, students, veterans, church groups. They held signs with Marcus's face, with slogans like, "Respect the uniform," and "Justice demands action." Counter-protesters arrived too, waving American flags and "Support our judges" banners. That night, someone spray-painted "Tyrant in robes" across the courthouse steps. Inside his home, Judge Blake raged. He paced his study, gripping a tumbler of bourbon with whitening knuckles, watching cable news dissect his career. He barked at his wife, ignored his daughter's calls, and threw the morning newspaper across the room. "This is a witch hunt," he growled. "They want to hang me in the streets." But outside, the story kept growing. Journalists unearthed older cases, families came forward, and retired court staff quietly provided tips. One former juror admitted that Blake had given them advice during deliberations in a similar case. In Washington, D.C., the National Military Council held a press conference. Major General Dana Whitaker stood at the podium, her voice sharp. "Colonel Marcus Turner served this country with honor. He deserves the same in return. We demand his release and a full judicial review." By the end of the month, the Department of Justice announced an official investigation into Blake's court. Inside his cell, Marcus heard the news on a broken radio shared between inmates. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply reached for his journal, turned the page, and kept writing. The cold wind of February did not deter the team of federal investigators as they walked up the courthouse steps in Ashland Springs. It was early morning when they arrived, 6 agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, escorted by local marshals, armed with warrants and backed by national authority. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Clerks whispered nervously. Officers stood straighter. Judge Blake's chambers remained closed, the blinds drawn shut. Carla Reyes and Jasmine were in attendance, watching from the far side of the plaza as news cameras buzzed and the federal team entered the courthouse. Jasmine gripped the strap of her messenger bag, her eyes locked on the building that had once swallowed her father's freedom. "They're not just looking into your father's case," Carla said quietly beside her. "They're reviewing everything." The inquiry expanded beyond anything Ashland Springs had ever experienced. Every file from Blake's courtroom was subject to audit. Dozens of past cases were reopened, and subpoenas were issued to prosecutors, court clerks, and even jurors. Patterns emerged, glaring ones. Over 200 cases demonstrated disproportionate sentencing against people of color. Expert witnesses had been blocked, plea deals dismissed without grounds, critical evidence barred on dubious technicalities. A special ethics committee convened in Jefferson City to evaluate Judge Blake's conduct. For the first time in decades, the integrity of the entire judicial circuit was in question. Judge Blake was forced to give a deposition. Under oath, his responses were clipped, his tone defensive. I ruled based on the law, he repeated. But the pattern suggests bias. An investigator pressed. I don't consider race. I consider conduct. And yet, the investigator said, laying out a list of statistics. Your sentencing conduct says otherwise. Back at the prison, Marcus received transcripts of the proceedings. He read them with the same focus he once used to decode battlefield maps. He knew systems didn't change overnight, but cracks were forming. And light was starting to slip through. When the ethics committee in Jefferson City allowed public testimony, Jasmine seized the opportunity. She stood at the lectern of a packed chamber. Her voice amplified across television sets and live streams. My father, Colonel Marcus Elijah Turner, served this country for over 20 years. He led men through war zones. He earned commendations from generals. He returned home only to be reduced to a criminal by a man who never looked past his skin color. Judge Blake sat behind a table with his lawyer. His jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. Jasmine continued. Judge Blake denied him a fair defense. He blocked witnesses. He dismissed key evidence. And he did so not because of justice, but because of bias. And if it happened to my father, it happened to others. She presented documents, Finch's testimony, the racial disparity charts, quotes from Blake's own clerk emails. The room went still. Today I don't speak as a daughter, she said, her voice steady. I speak as a legal advocate. And I demand an investigation not just into Judge Blake, but into every case he has touched. After her speech, Carla approached the committee with a formal motion, an immediate judicial review and retrial for Marcus Turner. Citing judicial misconduct, violation of due process, and abuse of authority. Within hours, the committee announced that Judge Blake would be suspended pending investigation, and that Marcus's case would be re-examined. The retrial was scheduled for late March. This time, it would not be held in Ashland Springs but in Jefferson City. Under the oversight of a new judge appointed by the state Supreme Court, Judge Amanda Whitlock. Known for her impartiality and fierce defense of constitutional rights, Marcus was transferred from the state prison to a secure holding center near Jefferson. As the van passed through open fields, he sat silently, shackled but not broken. He thought of his family, of Eliza, of Jasmine, of the voices that had risen to defend his name. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. Journalists filled the gallery. Activists and veterans sat shoulder to shoulder with law students and civilians. The air buzzed not with hostility, but with anticipation. The prosecution, sensing the weight of public scrutiny, offered a deal. Plead guilty to a lesser charge, receive time served, and walk free. Marcus declined. I'd rather sit in a cell another year than accept a lie just to be released. The trial lasted 3 days. Carla led the defense. Methodical and brilliant, she exposed every flaw in the original case, how Marcus was arrested without cause, how evidence was withheld, how Blake's rulings stripped him of due process. The prosecution struggled. Their case had never been strong. Now, under a microscope, it fell apart. When Marcus took the stand, he didn't speak of bitterness. He spoke of truth. I don't want revenge, he told the jury. I want acknowledgement. I want every person who's been cast aside by this system to know that silence is not the only option. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict. Not guilty. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled. Jasmine wept into her mother's shoulder. Carla smiled for the first time in weeks. And Marcus, still calm, nodded once, dignified, resolute. He was free. Back in Ashland Springs, the fallout began. Judge Blake's resignation came via fax, no press conference, no public apology. His letter cited health concerns and media distortion. But the ethics committee released its own report hours later, painting a brutal portrait of prejudice cloaked in jurisprudence. Dozens of convictions under Blake were now under review. Several had already been overturned. One prosecutor resigned. A court clerk came forward, confessing she'd falsified jury pool data to match the judge's preferences. A grand jury began considering charges of judicial misconduct and civil rights violations against Blake. Harold Finch testified again, this time before a federal panel. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said, I let this happen once. I'm not letting it happen again. As for Marcus, he returned home to a hero's welcome. Eliza had decorated the front porch in red, white, and blue. Neighbors brought food. Veterans offered hugs and salutes. But Marcus didn't crave celebration. He craved peace. In the quiet of his study, he opened his journal and began the final chapter. Not one of pain, not of anger, but of purpose. Because justice had been delayed. But it had not been denied. The sun was barely rising when Marcus stepped into the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., wearing his army dress blues for the first time in years. They still fit. Polished shoes. A chest full of ribbons. The silver star gleamed against the navy fabric, reflecting the flashes of the cameras waiting outside. It was the first time the nation would hear from him directly in a public address since his release. Inside, the atmosphere was somber but electric. The auditorium was filled with civil rights leaders, veterans, legal scholars, and congressional representatives. The Department of Justice had invited Marcus to speak at the opening session of a national symposium on judicial accountability. His case now a symbol of how deeply injustice could rot inside the most sacred halls of American democracy. He stood behind the podium, tall and still. He looked out at the faces before him, some skeptical, some tearful, all listening. "I didn't come here to recount the wounds," he began, voice steady. "You know my story. You've seen the coverage. But what you haven't seen is the price of silence, the erosion of trust. The unseen lives shattered long before mine." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I wore this uniform with pride. I risked my life for an idea, that liberty and justice are not just words etched in stone, but a living promise. That promise was broken not by bombs overseas, but by a gavel here at home." The crowd was silent, captivated. My case was not an anomaly. It was the product of a system that allows bias to hide in black robes and marble columns. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We can fix it. Not for me. I'm standing again. But for the next Marcus. The next child who steps into a courtroom and wonders if their skin will betray them before their words are even heard. When he finished, the room rose in unison. Not a standing ovation of applause, but one of solemn respect. Later that afternoon, the DOJ announced a new oversight division tasked specifically with investigating judicial conduct in rural jurisdictions. The Turner Review Commission, as it came to be unofficially known, would live on long after the applause faded. A month after the symposium, Marcus received a letter on official White House stationery. It was a formal invitation to the Medal of Liberty ceremony, a rarely awarded honor granted to civilians and veterans who had made extraordinary contributions to justice and human rights. The last recipient had been a civil rights attorney posthumously honored 10 years prior. The ceremony took place on the South Lawn. Jasmine stood beside him, wearing the same white suit she had worn to testify in Jefferson City. Eliza was radiant in navy, her hand gripping Marcus's with quiet pride. General Dana Whitaker stood in full dress uniform, offering a crisp salute as Marcus was called to the stage. The president himself fastened the medal around Marcus's neck. The words spoken in front of the national press were brief, but they echoed. Colonel Marcus Turner reminds us that true patriotism does not come only from the battlefield, but from the courtroom, from the streets, and from the strength to stand for others when no one else will. After the ceremony, Marcus stood for photos, shook hands with leaders from across the country, and accepted embraces from veterans he'd never met, some black, some white, some crying openly. But the moment that etched deepest was when a teenage boy approached him shyly, holding a copy of Time magazine with Marcus's portrait on the cover. "Sir," the boy said, voice trembling, "you're the reason I want to study law." Marcus knelt slightly so their eyes met. "Then study hard," he said, "because justice needs you." The Turner family never returned to Ashland Springs. They moved to St. Louis, where Jasmine accepted a fellowship at a top legal defense nonprofit. Eliza opened a small wellness clinic near their new home, one focused on trauma recovery and therapy, quiet, essential work that gave her peace. Marcus declined multiple offers to write books or run for office. Instead, he joined the board of directors at the Equal Justice Alliance and co-founded the Sentinel Project, a legal defense initiative aimed at helping falsely convicted veterans navigate the appeals system. The program was launched with a $10 million federal grant and quickly gained momentum. He traveled across the country speaking at law schools, military academies, and correctional facilities. He never charged a speaking fee. He told his story over and over, not for praise, but for remembrance. I don't want anyone to forget how quickly dignity can be taken when we let fear speak louder than fairness. In Jefferson City, the Missouri State Bar voted to disbar Ronald Blake permanently and refer his conduct to federal prosecutors. Charges were pending, though he had retreated from public life. His once proud name now synonymous with judicial disgrace. Jasmine, now a practicing attorney, continued her work dismantling the legacies of systemic injustice, case by case, voice by voice. On the wall of her office hung a framed quote from Marcus's testimony. Silence is not the only option. Below it was a photo. Marcus in his blues. Jasmine by his side. The Capitol dome behind them. Years passed. Time softened some of the edges. But the story of Marcus Turner remained part of the American conscience. His case became required reading in constitutional law classes. A documentary titled Unbroken, The Colonel and the Judge won an Emmy for investigative journalism. A mural of Marcus was painted on the wall of a community center in Ferguson. Standing not in anger, but with calm, dignified strength. And every year, on the anniversary of his exoneration, the Turner Review Commission held a public hearing, where former inmates, family members, lawyers, and judges would gather to share stories, victories, and the long road ahead. Marcus didn't always attend. Sometimes he stayed home, sitting with Eliza on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the wind rustle through the maple trees. But one morning, Jasmine brought her newborn son to visit. She handed the child into Marcus's arms, his tiny fingers curling around Marcus's uniform medal. "What's his name?" Marcus asked. "Justice," Jasmine replied, "not because he's the end of the fight, but because he's the reason to keep going." Marcus looked down at the boy and felt a quiet tear slip down his cheek. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't from pain, it was from hope, because justice had come slowly. But it had come, and now, it would live on.